Now for the first session of the conference, which is designed to set the scene for a number of discussions to come, for which we have the State of the Tropics report as a backdrop. We know the world is changing rapidly around us, massive change that in many ways is impossible to comprehend, really. And globally we're confronted by some massive challenges. As the report illustrates, as Sandra has just said, the regions we're focusing on here over the next 2 days have challenges writ large, but they also go hand in hand with great opportunities. We're here to define the challenges, listen to some expert views on what we should be doing to meet them, and to set the scene, as I said, let me introduce Jason Baker, the Head of Strategy and Chief Information Officer at IBIS World, a leading global industry market research group. Jason has replaced Phil Riven, the founder of IBIS World, who's ill, unfortunately. Jason has extensive experience in Asia and the US with IBIS World and was a weekly columnist at BRW magazine. Would you please welcome Jason Baker.
Thank you, Kerry. Good morning, distinguished guests, of which there are many. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to spend some time setting the scene before some further detailed discussion by subject experts. Excuse if my voice is a little nasally. I am grateful to have escaped the Melbourne winter to present this beautiful place, but do have a touch of a cold. The focus of this conference is the tropics, and I'm sure many of you have read the insightful report by Professor Harding and her team, but it is worth putting the state of the tropics into the context of the rest of the world and, indeed, Australia. Therefore, I'd like to discuss the global perspective, touch on the tropics as an additional focus to world comparisons, have a quick look at Australia, and then to touch on what Australia's tropics look like compared to the rest of Australia as a whole. This is meant to be a quick scene-setting presentation, so I may rush through some of these slides, but they will be available for download later on if you would like to see them. So the global perspective. World GDP has grown around 3.5% for the last 60, 70 odd years, and it's interesting to note that apart from a small recession during the GFC in 2009, the world economy has not gone backwards at all during that period. World growth looks like it's actually going to accelerate over the next few years, partly because developing countries are becoming a larger share of world GDP. So you're starting to see China and India, in particular, becoming a larger chunk of world GDP, and they're growing faster than the world as a whole. There are some dips every few years. Every 7 or 8 years, the world, particularly developed countries, go through a bit of a downturn in their business cycle, but never enough to turn the world into a recession. Looking at the world's largest economies, and this is by purchasing power parity, which is basically saying, instead of just looking in dollar terms, it's saying if a loaf of bread costs 30 cents in China and costs $3 in the US, it's still a loaf of bread. On this measure, the US is still the world's largest economy, but not significantly larger than China, and India has now overtaken Japan. When we compare that to the world's population, though, it's a different group of countries to the previous slide, though perhaps not as different as it was 30 years ago, where you would not have seen China or India on the GDP chart so significantly, but you certainly would have in population terms. The US, only 4.5% of the world's population, but still significantly the world's largest economy. There are many ways to analyse and dissect the world. Firstly, a quick look at religion. There is no one dominant religion in the world. Christianity is still significantly larger than Islam, but nothing is a majority. While all of the religions of the world have areas of the globe where they are the dominant religion, most of them can be found to some extent or another in each of the many different regions of the world. So there is this cohabitation. It's not like one chunk of the world is Christian and another chunk is Islam, as may often be portrayed. And of course, as always been the case throughout history, religion's been used as an excuse for conflict, as we are seeing it at the moment. Political systems. Most of the world lives in democracies, though many of them are imperfect. This probably shouldn't come as a surprise, as good democracy is expensive and really probably requires a high standard of living to ensure honest and free elections, a corruption-free government where the public service has paid sufficient amounts of money that the police and judiciary are not tempted into bribery and corruption. And perhaps a somewhat educated populace to be able to make informed decisions on political leaders. It is interesting to note that China, which does not have a democracy, has a GDP per capita 50% higher than that of the Tropics region, which is dominated by democracies. Now, that's not to give an opinion on the social merits of democracy, but merely to say that it can be an anchor to growth in developing countries. Empires and clubs. The world's always been split into regions and powers. Empires have probably become out of fashion over recent decades, although perhaps someone forgot to tell Vladimir Putin that. He seems intent on recreating the USSR. But it is interesting to compare empires old and new. The backdrop of the chart is today's modern economic regions, and overlaid on that is some historical empires. The British Empire was built on a population base of only 20 million people in what is now the UK in the late 18th century. It's interesting that GDP growth during the time of the dominance of the British Empire only averaged 2% per annum. So the world indeed has changed its dynamicism since then substantially. The US dominance, which peaked post-World War II, where the US reached 40% of world GDP, even during that time the US averaged growth of only 3.5%. Yet to think that China since 1950 has averaged 8% GDP growth per annum. So the world as a whole, as its industry mix has changed, has really accelerated its growth. The richest economies, similar to the earlier chart, but this is just purely in dollar terms. We can see on the right side there the OECD, the rich club as they're known, 64% of world GDP there, but we can start to see the emergence here of the so-called BRIC countries, the developing countries of Brazil, Russia, India and China, which now account for 20% of world GDP. So the developing world is starting to have its day in the sun, so to speak. I'll get to the tropics as a geographic region later, but over history we've had many regional focuses leading through to those present today. The old East-West divide that was mentioned earlier, well, the East is now equal to the West in economic terms for probably the first time in history, and I don't think that'll ever change again. I think the East will continue to dominate just by sheer weight of population. It's currently growing at probably twice the rate of the West. North-South, we here in the South are only 12% of the world population, just by land mass, 12% of world GDP, sorry. Just by population and land mass, the South will never equal to the North. More importantly than North, South and East, West, though, we're starting to see the emergence of sovereign economic regions in the new age. There's 230 nations in the world today, and I guess they've emerged over time from smaller kingdoms and more tribal forms of government back prior to the 18th century. But since the 60s, we've seen the emergence of regional groupings for trade and investment, and to some extent government, starting with the USSR and the European Union. Now we've got trade groups like NAFTA, and increasingly trade within the Asia-Pacific region is becoming freer and freer. Whether a world government will evolve one day in the future, who knows? But in the meantime, we are seeing closer economic ties on a regional level. It's interesting to note that the Asia-Pacific region, of which Australia is a member, is the largest of those groupings. Just looking at the importance of those regions in terms of population and economy. The Asia-Pacific, 33% of world GDP and a similar ratio to population, so it's now becoming the dominant economic force worldwide. North America punches above its weight in terms of economy to population. And you can see there that the Indian subcontinent, which is only 7% of world GDP, is 23% of the population. Africa, only 4% of the world's economy, which somewhat explains the lesser economic power that these groupings have, even if they are dominant population forces. It also shows that their GDP per capita is very, very low relative to the rest of the world, so they have a long way to go to get their population out of poverty. Changing economic importance. What we've seen over the past century or so is the rise and then decline of Western Europe. It was once 1/3 of the world's economy. We've certainly seen the rise and then fall of North America. It also reached 1/3 of the world economy in the 50s. And we've seen the re-emergence of Asia-Pacific, mainly through China, and also the Indian subcontinent. In the 1870s, prior to the Industrial Revolution really taking force, because of their large populations, they were significant economic powers in their own right. And once again, that's becoming the case and likely to continue forevermore. So, a look at the tropics. The tropics is interesting and important because it has some of the greatest challenges in terms of population growth, emergence from poverty, biodiversity, and the need for infrastructure. As Professor Harding said before, the tropic zone accounts for 40% of the world's population, yet it is only 1/5 of GDP. It's growing faster than the rest of the world's economy at the rest of the world's economy is growing at 3.2%. The tropics is growing at 3.8%, which is great. However, the tropics are growing slower than the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. The tropics do have a lower standard of living as a whole, and the Asia-Pacific region as well. Population moving towards the equator, perhaps partly because of what Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew said was the greatest invention of the 20th century, and that was air conditioning. As funny as that may seem, what it did allow was modern manufacturing and modern industry to exist near to the equator that it wasn't able to do beforehand. But as Professor Harding also said, the middle of this century, half of the world's population is going to be located in the tropics. So I think that also explains the timeliness of this study and why we need to understand it a little better. Looking at our regional groupings, we can see here that the tropical economies cover almost every region of the world except for Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And that's actually a real positive for the tropic region because of all those areas of the world, Western Europe and Eastern Europe are growing slower than every other economic region. As mentioned, 40% of world population dominated across India and Africa in terms of population. 15% of world energy generation, which is really very low. Again, it explains the lack of industry in a lot of these economies, but also the lack of energy for personal consumption. As a positive, though, it's 1/4 of the world's renewable energy. A standard of living of just half of the world average, but improving. So the tropics is getting better. It's getting better at a faster rate than the rest of the world, but it is way behind the rest of the world as a whole. In some areas, such as Australia and Singapore, it's way above the world standard. In others, such as Malaysia or Mexico, Brazil, it's about even with the world average, but most of the rest of the tropics is substantially below the world average of $13,000 GDP per capita. But if you read Professor Harding's excellent report, you'll find far more detail on that on those facts. Having compared the tropics to the world, it might be worth a quick look at Australia and to compare that to our own tropical region. Australia's population, 23 million and counting, will likely hit 70 million by the end of this century. But more interesting is the change in where our population lives. Since the turn of the last century, we've seen a huge population shift from the bush to the capital cities and to coastal areas. And this trend is expected to continue, with most of the growth in coastal areas expected to be the north of the country into the tropics. What does the Australian economy look like? We've gone through various economic ages, starting as a very agricultural-based economy, moving through the industrial age and into an information-based economy, and our GDP has continued to grow. So the change of industry mix is really interesting. We can see here back in the 1800s, agriculture and mining came to dominate the Australian economy. Then through the 50s and 60s, we saw the emergence of our manufacturing sector. It's since declined. And the services sector, which was only, say, a third of our economy 150 years ago, is now 70% or more of our economy and likely to continue growing faster than any other part. Australia's tropics, though, are a different economy. So we only have 1/3 of Australia's population living in the tropical regions, which is crazy given the share of the land mass. And that top 1/3 is basically the tropical region. We know worldwide populations are moving towards the equator, and that's the same that's happening in Australia. As was mentioned earlier, Australia's north was not really developed much until after the 60s, certainly not until the post-war era. Our north contains only 4% of our population, 1 million people, on land 1.5 times that of the area of Indonesia, which has 250 million people. Quite a stark contrast. So far it's been mining and tourism that's led the way in economic growth in the tropics. Perhaps we'll see a renaissance in agriculture with overseas investment, but the industry mix is certainly changing. The economic mix of tropical Australia, though, is really a proxy for the tropics as a whole. We see here an economic mix for the north of Australia, probably quite similar to what the whole of Australia had back in the agrarian age of the 1860s. As I showed a few slides ago, in 1860, agriculture and mining was more than half of Australia's GDP, yet it's now fallen to only about less than 10% for Australia as a whole. And as we look at the southern states, we can see that agriculture and mining is, in fact, less than 5% of GDP. But in the north, it's a staggering 51% or more. Most tropical economies probably reflect this as well. The Australian tropics are lucky to some extent. They do not have a well-developed manufacturing sector, given the impact of the decline of manufacturing on the southern states. But they do have a far less developed service sector. While the region exports large amounts of primary product, it needs to import from outside the region, if not outside the country, financial and business services, communication and IT services that are dominated in the southern states. The development of these new age industries will be a big challenge for the region in the future, not just because they are growing faster, but also because they pay far higher wages. These issues can be partly addressed by policymakers, but they'll also partly evolve over time as population in the north reaches a critical mass to be able to sustain some of these service industries. Okay, that's it for me. I hope that's provided some scene setting for everyone here. If you would wish to download this presentation, you can do so at the IBIS World website. Back to you, Kerry.
Thank you very much, Jason, and more food for thought for what's to come.